So Varlamore has been out for almost a month now, and we've had time to see how the market will react to this pretty massive new update. There are tons of new items with Varlamore, and beyond that, the update has had a pretty wide-reaching effect on a ton of existing items in the game. So today we're going to try to break down what the hell is happening in the old school Runescape market this month. Now, there's a ton of new items to look at, and I kind of want to start here because I think they're really interesting. Let's start off by looking at Sunfire splinters. This is an item that has been probably one of the most talked about of the new items, and it's a currency item that's meant to be used with a bunch of new things around Varlamore. It's used to charge the Diana's quiver. You can use it in the new prayer training method. You can use it to make Sunfire runes. And let's look at what the price has done throughout the month. Well, they started off at around 1,000, but quickly started to fall in price. Now, Jagex did make a change to the Sunfire splinters last week, making them less common from the first wave, but more likely to get them later in the waves, and you can even exchange a Diana's quiver for 4,000 Sunfire splinters. So sure, they are more common at later waves, but if you look at the actual amount traded, they have gone down drastically since the peak of the content's popularity 1 or 2 weeks in. For example, on March 28th, there was 28 million bought and sold during the day, and today we only have 11 million. So that is a significant amount less, and you can see that it appears like Sunfire splinters would become more common. They actually dropped in volume significantly because the reality is most people can only complete the first couple of waves. It was a really easy way for lower level players to make money, and by reducing that, the overall supply has gone down a lot. So that's all to say that Sunfire splinters have retained a pretty even price right now at around 1,000 each. It's pretty impressive. Now that can't be said for all the new items from the Coliseum. We have Echo Crystals, which have been continuously falling. Even though Echo Crystals have received a bit of a buff on April 4th as well, or at least a proposed buff, it hasn't really seemed to matter too much. They've still fallen another 7 mil this week alone and are just continuing to plummet in price. Now this is really because Echo Crystals aren't that good, and they never really were meant to be an expensive item, because really you're just adding charges to something. It's akin to something like a Blood Fury. So it was never going to be a 50 to 100 mil item. How far is it going to fall? It's hard to say. Right now the only thing really propping up its price at all is just the simple rarity of Coliseum items, even though it is the most common one, and the lack of players who are actually able to complete the Coliseum. It is really high level content. You're only able to get Echo Crystals from, at minimum, the 7th wave, and there's really only a couple hundred traded per day as of yet. Now, I think a lot of people were surprised with how rare the Sunfire Fanatic armor turned out to be. It's an upgrade to Proselyte, yet it's super rare from the Coliseum. Like, there's only a handful traded per day, even still. The armor has fallen a bit, but it's stabilized, and this is really just down to how rare it is. For the last couple days, it is kind of bottomed out at about 50 mil for the entire set, but this armor is incredibly rare, and only a very minute amount of the population is even doing this content. So realistically, the Sunfire armor probably is not worth 50 mil for the entire thing, but unless it becomes drastically more common, it will probably still command a reasonably high price just due to the difficulty of the Coliseum and its rarity. And the final item from the Coliseum is the glaive of Perilous, I'm just going to call it that. Now this was by far the most expensive item and started off at well over 500 mil, but has been very, very quickly dropping in price, except for this big spike you might notice right here. Now a week ago they mentioned that there's going to be Varlamore tweaks. Now the one that's related to the glaive is they're going to be removing the 50% cap on defense reduction from its special attack, which is just going to allow it to be used in a lot more locations, or at least in theory. Now there's obviously a huge spike in price as soon as that information came out, actually nearly doubled, but it has quickly fallen back down again. I think due to the uncertainty of whether, even with that change, the glaive, where is it going to actually be used, it's kind of hard to tell. Currently, I think it seems still to be pretty niche. So the Coliseum is the high-end PVM section of Varlamore, but there is a mid-level one, and that is the Perilous Moons. Now, there's actually quite a lot of interesting items that came out with the Perilous Moons. Now, the most expensive armor piece right now is actually the Blood Moon Tassets. These are more expensive than they were on like day 2, and I think it really comes down to the fact that these are way better than I think most people thought they're going to be. Honestly, the entire Blood Moon set is quite strong. Now you have to keep in mind all of these armor pieces are degradable, but they last for much longer than barrows do, like up to I think 50 hours. And the Blood Moon Tassets are comparable to Bandos in a lot of ways. They have the same strength bonus. They even have a good magic defense bonus, so they're actually excel over Bandos in certain circumstances. And they're only 5 mil, so they're significantly cheaper. So it's 5.4 mil for the Tassets. The chest plate's about 2 mil. I assume that's cheaper because, you know, you could always go get yourself a fighter torso. And even the weapon, the dual Maku Hutul, is almost 2 mil as well. So it's actually quite an expensive set, overall nearly 10 mil. The next most expensive set is the Blue Moon, which is the mage option. The Tassets for these are almost 5 mil once again as well. I have no idea why the Tassets are more expensive. Looking at the amount traded, it seems to be the same. I assumed that the Tassets would somehow have been rare, which wouldn't really make that much sense, but no, the amount traded is pretty similar. Once again, Blue Moon is kind of comparable to Arim's. And finally here we have the Eclipse set. Overall, the Eclipse set is much cheaper, but there is one item that's interesting, the Addle, which is the weapon, which actually is pretty good in the Coliseum itself. And that's kind of why it has become the most expensive of the Perilous Moon weapons, coming in at about 3 mil-ish. All in all, I would say I'm actually kind of surprised how well these items have held their value. Now obviously none of them are extremely valuable, but for how common the items are and how accessible the content is, these items actually turned out to be quite good for their levels. And I think that is what is helping them retain some value because they're quite common. Now there's a couple other smaller items I just wanted to have a look at. The Moonlight Moth Mix. Now it's a 2-dose potion that gives you I think 22 prayer back per use, but it also gives it to allies around you. So it's kind of an interesting item and it's pretty cheap. I mean, you think about it, 44 prayer back for 2,000. A prayer potion is giving you about 100, but it's like 10,000, so it's almost half off. Now, I'm not sure exactly where that's useful, but pretty interesting. And finally, we have the highest level hunter meat, which is the cooked moonlight antelope, coming in at about 2,200 for a 26 health heal, albeit it is broken into 2 parts, one for a larger chunk, one for a smaller chunk. So you're not going to get all that healing at once, but for a lot of places that doesn't really matter too much. So for a lot of instances, they're just now the new best food item. Now in a big PVM update that comes out like the Coliseum, normally that changes the market drastically based on what items turn out to be meta and which ones didn't. But one thing that's kind of interesting with the Coliseum is there's actually not one strict weapon that is best throughout most of the waves. The monsters have very low defenses, which means you can use a lot of different items to get through the Coliseum waves. There's people using shadows, twisted bows, abyssal tentacles, venator bows. I mean, anything's kind of on the table. So that means there's actually been a little bit less movement than I originally thought. With that said though, there are still a few clear winners and losers. By far one of the biggest winners has got to be the Scythe, due to the low defense nature of pretty much all the monsters in the waves and the fact that it is best in slot at the boss. The Scythe has continued its really meteoric rise this year, going from about just over $1 bill up to 1.2 bill thanks to the Coliseum. And if you look at the year, I mean, it's up over 3 times in value, which is kind of insane. It's finally actually on par with the other mega rare items, or at least price wise. It just kind of goes to show how important having updates that actually favor the Scythe is. I mean, they did buff it, but being best in slot at the Coliseum is way more important. Now another item that jumped up a lot this month is the Saradomin Godsword, going from about 20 mil up to 50 mil at its peak, so over doubling in price. And you can see the popularity jumped up with Varlamore. Now in the Coliseum there are a quartet of Fremeniks, which is just 3 little minions that you can kill. If you use the right style to kill them, you will always hit your max hit, which means using a Saradomin Godsword spec on specifically the Ranger minion would give you a massive heal and some prayer back, which is one of the best ways to sustain through the waves without having to use food, is why the Saradomin Godsword is so good and why it has doubled. Another item that's been really good during the waves and has jumped up a lot this month is the Venator Bow. You can see how many people were using it right on release. Jumped up from 400 traded a day to 2,000, 3,000, that's crazy. And the price also went from around 40, 50 mil up to 70 mil. And this item's just been on a huge tear recently. The Venator bow is quite good. It allows you to AoE monsters in the waves, either for speedrunning strategies or just for dealing with the Fremniks. It's just a pretty strong overall weapon. Now the Tunic in Shadow actually has seen a fair bit of use during the waves. Gives you a lot more flexibility and is really good at powering through the actual Coliseum waves. On release day, it dropped from 1.5 bill to 1.4 bill, but has since jumped right back up and is still hovering around 1.5. Pretty much that means that it does have a strong use in the Coliseum. If it didn't, this item would be plummeting pretty quickly, I would say, for the near future. The Eldritch Orb is another interesting item. Similar to the Saradomin Godsword, it offers a huge amount of health and prayer back. Pretty much the same concept. You can spec the melee minion to get a ton of resources back, and because of that, it jumped up from 300 mil to 400 mil, like a 25% increase on the Eldritch, which is pretty impressive. It's a very expensive item still. And finally here for the Coliseum, we have the Kodai Wand, which has also gone up quite a bit since the Coliseum. About 40 mil it's increased, and you can see how much more popular it is as well. Similar to the Inferno, this is just a very good weapon if you want to use Ancients during the Coliseum. And a few items that were pretty heavily speculated on before the update: Guardian Boots, simply because they turn into the new Echo Boots. Well, it turns out they didn't need to be 11 mil, they've dropped pretty quickly to about 5 mil, mostly just because Echo Boots aren't that good. We have Justiciar, which has dropped from 70 mil to 50 mil. Now this is hyped up due to the Perilous Moons, as the Perilous Moons was marketed as requiring high defenses to do it effectively, and that's why Justiciar jumped up so much. In reality, it is mid-level content, so at mid-levels you definitely need to prioritize defensive gear in particular. But for high levels, people who would be able to afford Justiciar or have it, you could just use Bandos, you could use Torva if you have it. You don't really need to prioritize defense like this in particular. Now, there's definitely a couple other interesting things that happened this month. Just this week, there was a pretty big visual bug with the Runescape data price tracking, where you could see things like twisted bows and sights selling for like 100 GP, and most mega rare items had dropped 90%. Now, visual bugs like this can happen, but in this case in particular, it's actually because the beta worlds were getting their prices tracked as well, which was kind of mingling the data, completely tanking the price of most expensive items. In the end though, it was just a visual bug. None of those items were ever sold at that price, really. Now, if you look at the price of the Venator ring, it has dropped so much this month. It's pretty sad. It's gotta be bots, right? Now, there was a post on Reddit showing that the top, I think, 50 players on the Leviathan high scores are almost all bots or gold farmers, certainly. And if you look at the price of the Venator ring, I mean, kind of checks out. It has dropped almost in half this month. Now, another explanation I think could make sense is the Dizana's Quiver no longer requires you to have the Venator ring to get a max hit, so the value of that has dropped a bit. But if you also look at the amount traded, it has gone from 150, 160 every day up to 300, so there's just a ton more coming into the game, there's no doubt. Same issue with the Bellator ring, it has dropped down to 44 mil. This month alone, it's lost like 30% of its value. And also enhanced teleport crystals, those are continuing to drop, going from 2.3 mil down to 1.8. This item is heavily botted all the time. Once the demand drops a bit, the price just plummets because there's so many bots thieving from elves. Anyway guys, that's going to be it for today's market recap. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.